I think we should start. Just want to say that the fly sheets that you have belong to an earlier presentation. They were prepared by Professor Nader al-Bizri. I've managed to ruin his presentation, but I didn't have enough time to work on the fly sheet. I mean, 2 years, but I can be a bit slow. Uguay is slow, a turtle. I'm assuming that you know Master Uguay. There is this part of Kung Fu Panda, which is called Uguay's Ascents. And it is accompanied by the brilliant music by Hans Zimmer. I'm hoping that you've seen that. Otherwise, something is really missing in your education. And as Uguay ascends, you see the dissolution of the body. You see a person at a culmination of a certain journey, a culmination in wisdom and serenity. This is a very old theme, but it's also very recurrent. The questions, the host of issues which is related to ascension or wisdom or the dissolution of the body was seen at different times as belonging to religion or as belonging to philosophy. I don't know what you're thinking, but in the course you're taking, these issues seem to merge. The course has a time frame. It says here that we're going to study the Abrahamic monotheistic traditions from late antiquity to the 13th century. This is a map of Rome at around 200 or the 2nd century AD. I'm hoping that you can see it properly. And late antiquity is a periodization suggested by a scholar, Peter Brown, in his book, Late Antiquity from Aurelius to Muhammad. And this usually suits the purposes of historians who are more interested in politics and society. And it ranges somehow between what we call the Roman imperial crisis in the 3rd century AD up to the rise of Islam and what we call the Middle Ages in Europe, so around the 7th century. The 13th century marks the opposite limit, and in the 13th century, supposedly, a certain way of doing philosophy reaches an end in the Islamic world, and Europe is preparing to have its renaissance. So we have a starting point of something else. This is the Mediterranean at around 1100. The 11th century. This is the century of Ghazali you're going to read. The earlier map probably was a map to which Augustine belongs. And if you look at Europe at around this time, you see that not only Europe, the whole Mediterranean, there is a delineation between the heirs of the Roman Empire and the Muslim world. You see, for example, the Muravids down in North Africa, Murabitun, and the Caliphate of Cairo. And to the east, you have the Salajika and the Ismailis. Al-Ghazali was very concerned with the Ismailis, as you're going to see. But at the end of the century, we have the start of the Crusades, and in the next century, you have the Mughal invasion. So again, the whole map will be altered. Again, if you look at this, this is 13th century, late 13th century. You have a Crusaders' kingdom in Palestine and Lebanon, what we would call today. And you have in the west the Mohads, al-Muwahhidun, under which Ibn Rushd is going to work. You're going to read Ibn Rushd. You're going to read Maimonides, who also worked with the 2 or 4, the Ayyubids in Egypt and Syria. Anyhow, this is a historical periodization, as I said, which usually suits the purposes of those historians interested in politics, society. But there is a subtle distinction when we come to periodizing intellectual history. So there is a suggestion that despite the fact that you can look at late antiquity as an entity, as a historical entity, and then you can talk about the Middle Ages, in intellectual terms, there seems to be a continuity. And there is a linking thread, and this linking thread is Neoplatonism, a philosophy which inherits to an extent all the earlier philosophies which were at work in the ancient world. I've mentioned Aurelius. You must know, you might have seen Ridley Scott's Gladiator, so the old man there who dies and leaves the empire to his son Commodus. The picture is very lousy, huh? I've tried to use high-resolution pictures. Doesn't help. Anyhow, Aurelius didn't die that old. He died at 59. But one thing the film captures properly is, again, what I've called earlier the imperial crisis. His son Commodus brings about the ruin of the empire, so to speak. This is Aurelius. Aurelius was a very phenomenal person. Historians have this habit of saying that his only mistake is giving birth to his son Commodus. He was a philosopher. He lived between 121 AD and 180 AD. And in 176, he visited Athens, and he made an endowment in Athens. He sponsored 4 schools of philosophy: the Aristotelian, the Platonic, the Stoic, and the Epicurean. These 4 schools, as the terms of the endowment insist, and as the case was, were somehow mutually exclusive. They were closed communities. Only later on, some sort of eclectic thinking starts appearing, and you see this in Aurelius himself, where people bring elements from both or from 2 or more schools. But at the time, each of these philosophies catered for a way of life. They were supposed to answer the basic questions of what is the world about, and how are we to conduct ourselves in this? What is happiness? Does it consist in virtue, or in, as the Aristotelians and the Stoics would say, or does it consist in freedom from pain, as the Epicurean would insist? Anyhow, this is, by the death of Aurelius, around the end of the 2nd century, this segregation into 4 major schools will disappear. Even at the time of Aurelius, Stoicism was the major school of thought. It somehow suited the Roman mindset. It emphasized duty, it emphasized a common humanity. But with the imperial crisis comes the dominance of a new sort of philosophy. Again, this is Neoplatonism. If we want to understand Neoplatonism, we have to look at Plato. This is not Plato, but I just wanted to say that the intention is to find out the purpose of life. In this case, it is obvious. In the case of Plato, I'll just read this quotation. He says, "We ought to fly away from earth to heaven as quickly as we can. And to fly away is to become like God as far as this is possible." This is a very important qualification that intellectuals or thinkers or schools later on tended to forget. And to become like him is to become holy, just, and wise. Plato worked in the 4th century Athens. At around that time, the Greek world has emerged from a major war between Athens and Sparta. Each has its own leagues and supporters. And Sparta prevailed, forcing a dictatorial sort of regime over Athens. And everyone could see how lousy it was. But then came the democracy of Athens. It was reinstated, but this democracy killed Socrates. And Plato considers Socrates as a model for how a journey should culminate, in the sense we saw with Uguay at the beginning. But if you look at Socrates, in the 18th century, there was a contest which asked painters and artists to portray this event, and this seems to have won the contest by Jacques-Louis David. Socrates has no issues with death. And this is one of the most basic questions. If you read Marcus Aurelius himself, the philosopher, in the only work that is left to us, death is a central issue. How do we deal with death? And Socrates seems to have dealt with the question of death, and he's pointing upward to a world which is more real. In Plato's philosophy, again, the major protagonist is Socrates himself. There is a distinction between a world of appearances, of illusion, this material world that we live in, the spatio-temporal world of change, and the world which is really real, the world of eternal archetypes, which does not change, which is perfect. And this distinction serves to solve several problems, several issues. One of them is what philosophers would call ontological. What is the basis of reality? So what is, in this sense, what is really real is this world of archetypes or models or ideals. People call it usually the world of forms or ideas. Everything in this world is perfect. And in the world that we live in, the world of illusion, we try to imitate that world. So this is the ontological part that the theory plays. But there is, I'm using so many terms, an epistemological part, which means it has to do with explanation, with knowledge. How do we understand what's going on in this world? How do we know the world of illusion that we live in? You know it, properly speaking, by understanding the forms. And this is a process which ultimately leads to some kind of theosis, deification. You become like God because you have access to a world of forms. So if I ask, what is a chair? How come all chairs have a similar form? The only explanation of the chairhood of the chair is that there is a form of chairness or chairhood somewhere in a more real world. Otherwise, you cannot understand things like how come Pythagorean theorem holds everywhere. I mean, even when you look at a circle or you look at a triangle in a half circle, how come is it right and it's always a right-angled triangle? Appealing to the forms tends to explain such a question and similar questions. But there is also a third role played by the world of forms. It is an ethical role. We look up to it. This is the world of perfection, and only by imitating it and assimilating to it, we become perfect. Now, Plato himself had seen that there are issues with this theory. And the staunchest person to argue against it was his student, Aristotle. Aristotle is thought to have said that Plato is my friend, but truth is more friend than Plato. And Aristotle suggested that we really don't need all this extravagant apparatus. You look at chairs, and you have a natural capacity to abstract what I've called chairness or chairhood. You look at circles and angles inscribed in semicircles, and your reason, your mind, through its natural capacity, universalizes or abstracts knowledge which applies to all circles, whether in the future, in the past, whether you've seen them or you haven't. In any sense, you can never see all the circles, but then you can say that all angles inscribed in semicircles are right. This is not because there is a world, a reality out there which has perfect circles in it, and all the circles that we see in this world are not like that. This is simply because we have a natural capacity to abstract. This will become a heated debate in medieval philosophy. And I wanted to say that medieval philosophy is, to a large extent, shaped by these initial questions. But when Plato died, and after 20 years in Athens, Aristotle was not made the head of the school, Plato's school, the academy. These guys here, Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach, wrote a book called Three Philosophers, and it deals with three philosophers. One of them is Aristotle. And they suggest that Aristotle, being Macedonian, always outraged at the homosexuality of the Athens, could never find himself the proper path to a successful career in Athens. So he left Athens, but he came back a short while ago, and he came back with his pupil, one of the strongest people living, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great could achieve something that the Greeks could never achieve. For the first time, he unified Greece under one political entity, and he occupied major parts of the known world at the time. This is a map around the death of Alexander. He died in 323, And if you look at, if you see, you cannot see it, huh? It's not a good picture. It shows us the journey of Alexander all the way to the east, but he made the journey crossing Lebanon all the way to the Libyan desert because he wanted to visit an Egyptian temple, the Amun temple. Of course, the world was not an intellectual vacuum at the time waiting for Aristotle and Plato to appear. There were the pre-Socratics, of course, themselves Greek to an extent, and there was this enigmatic Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, and there was the Egyptian civilization, which by then has lived more time than has passed between us and Aristotle and Plato. And it tended to provide so many of the answers that people needed, answers to the questions that I started with. What is this world about? How do we live it? What is happiness? What about death? Is there life after death? Etc. So these were serious questions. I mean, the heirs of Alexander, the Ptolemaics in Egypt, adopted Greek religion. And much of Greek thinking, even in Plato and Aristotle, is to an extent shaped by Egyptian and other influences. Nevertheless, this new opportunity allowed Aristotle to establish his new school, his own school, the Lyceum or the Peripatos. Aristotelians are called the Peripatetics. In Arabic, al-Masha'un or al-Masha'iyun, because the teachers used to walk as they teach, hence Peripatetics. And he had access to all the resources he could ask for. There is a main distinction that I should mention between Plato and Aristotle in terms of outlook. Plato tended to think of the world somehow mathematically. In a sense, there is the world of concepts, our own internal world, and he wanted to apply it to external reality, to shape this external world according to concepts which are perfect as far as mathematical concepts are perfect. Whereas I like to think of Aristotle as the biologist among philosophers. He had more of an organic take on reality. And during Alexander's reign, he had access to all samples. He sent scholars and students to the east to send them samples of sea animals and elephants and wildflowers, you name it. And the man practically established single-handedly much of the disciplines that you major in nowadays. And he didn't have any, supposedly, any help from revelation or whatever. So what do I mean by a biological take or an organic take on reality? If you look at this simple cup of coffee, I feel you need one. Aristotle says, this is a cup, like all cups, we know that, not because of a perfect cup somewhere. It's because we abstract out of it what makes it a cup. And this is what he calls a form. But his basic ontology, again, ontology is like a cataloging of reality. When you ask an ontological question, you ask, what is there? What is the furniture of the world? He says, this is a particular. And it is a particular substance. It's a cup. This is the most basic entity in reality. It's just one cup, spatiotemporal, sitting there. And it is white, so as a substance, it has certain properties. These he calls accidents. It cannot be except a cup. If it changes, it's no longer a cup, right? And but its color can change. Its size can change, whatever. These are called accidents. So the particular white here and the particular cup are basic entities. Out of these, you can abstract universal substances and universal accidents. You can think of the cup which exists only in your mind, the cup which you don't have access to right now despite your need. And you can think of the white, right? The white which you can see anywhere. This is a universal. The difference between a particular and the universal is that the universal applies to many different entities. You can think of a white wall, a white chair, a white board, etc. But there is only one white cup, which is this one, okay? So the bottom line here is that universals, or what Plato would call the forms, derive from particulars. These four things, particular substance, particular accident, universal substance, universal accident, contain the ontology of Aristotle. And this ontology is very basic. It is not extravagant as he would describe Plato's ontology. And he parsed it a little bit into his theory of categories. So he says there is just one substance, but there are many accidents, actually 9. So these are 10 categories. In Arabic, al-maqulat. I'm trying to tell you what the terms are in Arabic so that you see somehow the continuity between the traditions. And the Arabs had this habit of putting in verse what they wanted to memorize. And you have these two ugly abiyat, whatever. So Zayd is a substance. But al-tawil or al-azraq are accidents, because he could be short. If he could be someone other than Zayd, he wouldn't be Zayd. That's what distinguishes a substance from an accident. And the substance is the locus of all the accidents. It is Zayd who is tall and blue and the son of Malik or whatever. And all of these are accidents: quantity, quality, al-kam, al-kayf, nisba, ibn Malik, or relation, al-alaqa, etc. So you have 9 categories. I'm sure you'll have an occasion to mention these in class. And Platonists have serious issues with the categories. It's very hard to swallow because the assumption here is that the universals are dependent on the particulars. All these accidents, or all these universals, the tawil, azraq, which could apply to so many things, would not exist in the first place if there weren't a guy called Zayd who's blue, whatever that means. So if there's no object which is blue in the whole world, you couldn't think of blueness because there's no place you could abstract it from. Okay, this is a basic distinction between Plato and Aristotle. And it's not a simple story in the history of philosophy. Now, Aristotle had his investment in his own theory of knowledge, in his scientific approach. Again, he had all the sources. And he wrote much. And part of what he wrote, which we call the logic, Aristotle's logic, which prevailed for several centuries, was very influential. Much of it was early on translated into Arabic. Part of it was translated into Latin. And the rest of it was translated into Latin later on. I'll give you a sense of it. But in some of his, the logic of Aristotle is called the organon, which means an instrument of thought. So its role was instrumental, although later philosophers would think of it as an autonomous discipline, like Ibn Sina. In some of his logical works, like or general works, even a book he wrote on rhetoric, in another book which is called Prior Analytic, and in Posterior Analytic as well. These were translated into Arabic, and then the topics, Topica, Rhetorica, Analytica al-Ula, Analytica al-Thaniya. He suggests a certain structure for reasoning. He tells us what is accepted as an argument and what is to be rejected. So certain forms of thinking are not to be accepted. For example, you cannot compare Egyptian rice to Syrian cotton, for example. There are arguments which do not work. So you cannot say, look, the medievals had the habit of using Socrates for their examples, or Brownie, the donkey. Okay, so you cannot say Brownie is a donkey is a species, so Brownie is a species. Brownie is not a species. But you could say Brownie is a donkey, all donkeys are, let's say for the sake of the argument, stubborn, so Brownie is stubborn. That's legitimate. The idea, later philosophers, especially in the Islamic part of the world, would say that the aim is to bring about assent, tasdiq. Of course, you could bring about assent by many ways. There is what the medievals call argumentum ad baculum, which means the argument of the stick. So if someone cannot see the obvious, you might as well use a stick. This brings about assent. But Aristotle was more interested in the proper ways, or the scientific, the universal ways of bringing about assent. He says that an argument has premises, assumptions, and it has a conclusion. And if the argument is well devised, well structured, the conclusion should follow from the premises automatically. So if the premises are universal, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, conclusion, Socrates is mortal, you cannot defy the conclusion, right? In this case, this set of argument is called demonstrative. This is the sort of argument philosophers would use. But Aristotle thought that you can use other sorts of argument. I mean, he even, in the book that I've mentioned, Rhetoric, tells us how you can bring about assent using emotions, motivations. In another work, he says that if the premises are shared, that's fine. They don't have to be universal. Universal in the sense of necessary, and necessary in the sense of, like when you say all men are mortal. It's not necessary. I mean, we might find out someone who's not mortal. But it applies everywhere. If you're a Muslim, for example, and you accept the existence of God, you don't have to prove it. Your premise need not be that basic. So you share a premise with your co-religionist, and these premises would lead to certain conclusions that someone who's not a Muslim might not accept. This is called dialectic. Ibn Rushd, later on, you will see, is very much invested in these because he wants to say that the Quran appeals to all classes of people, the demonstrative class, the dialectic class, the more sentimental class, etc. So you see in Aristotle a trend to fulfill a scientific project. The categories show us a model of causal thinking. And in addition to that, Aristotle thought that you can never have a full explanation of things unless you have precisely this sort of causal explanation. That's Brownie, I thought so. The one to the left, if you're wondering. Back to the cup. So we want to explain, to know what this thing is. Aristotle suggested that there are 4 causes. Causes in an ontological sense, but also causes in an explanatory sense. Okay? The distinction is subtle, but you need not worry about it much now. So there is the matter of the cup, what it is made up of, say porcelain. But porcelain can be all sorts of things. This is why we need the form. And the form is more akin to the shape, but it is not the shape. I mean, you cannot imagine, maybe you can, but a flat cup is not a cup. So the shape of the cup in this case is very crucial for its function. It's a vessel. It has to hold things. If it doesn't hold things, it's not a cup. It's useless. You can call it a cup. You can call it whatever you want. But with the way we know cups, it won't be a cup. So you need matter and you need form. You can melt it and make something else out of it. This is why matter has a potential to be a cup and it has a potential to be a dish, the matter in this case. But you also, to have a full explanation, you need to evoke 2 other notions. You need what the medievals call the efficient cause, or the agent, which is the guy or the lady who builds this thing. And you also need, above all, and this for Aristotle was the most important, an agent. You need, an end, a purpose, a teleological cause. Why do we build this cup? Why is it for? Of course, in this case, it is for holding coffee or whatever. And without this cause, you cannot know what it is about. So what tells us essentially what a thing is about is its end, to a large degree. Even Aristotle's God is not the cause of everything. It is not a cause in all of these senses. Above all, Aristotle's God is the end, the purpose of everything. It does not do anything. It just contemplates itself. But it is the source of imitation for everything else. I shouldn't use imitation, but just I'm simplifying through and through. So everything which is in the world takes God as an end, right? And this is not very satisfactory because later philosophers, Neoplatonists, would want to include other forms of causation in God. And this project actually culminates in Aristotle, who would say that God is the cause in every sense, in every possible Aristotelian sense. The matter and form causes, or the material and the formal cause, play a different role in Aristotle. In a different sense, he thinks of them as potentiality and actuality, or act and potency. So an acorn, to use the regular example, is a tree. It's an oak tree, only potentially, right? I mean, Aristotle starts his metaphysics by saying all humans by nature desire to know. An indication of this is the delight we take in our senses. These are the first two sentences in the metaphysics, and you see the beauty of construction. A very straightforward claim and a very simple argument. But the idea is that, I mean, not all humans desire to know. You might know people who by nature desire not to know. This is where I tend to think of the argumentum ad baculum most, right? This is why, again, Aristotle will have to add potentially. All humans by nature desire to know. Potentially, we have the potential for it. We might not actualize it. It's like the acorn might rot and not become an oak tree, okay? Now, the acorn is, in a sense, matter, which will become, it itself will become the oak tree, but it is also potentiality. So matter for Aristotle is potentiality. And matter and form, this is again where the biological sort of thinking becomes relevant, are not two separate things. Of course, the form tells us that this is a cup. Otherwise, it could be a lump of porcelain or something, a dish, a plate, whatever. So the form tells us what it is, precisely. But the form and matter are not two separate things. Matter informed, in this case, is an acorn. In that case, it's a cup. It cannot exist without having a certain form. And you cannot separate them. You cannot separate the inside of the cup from the outside of the cup. This is what we call organic unity. But Aristotle would insist you can separate them in the mind. And this is what the medieval philosophers would say. In existence, in external existence, they are inseparable. In mental existence, they are separable. Right? Now, crucially, this gives us Aristotle's understanding of what God is, as opposed to Plato's God, which I'll tell you a thing about in a moment. But more importantly, this gives us Aristotle's understanding of the human soul. So for Aristotle, the human soul is the form, and the body is the matter, and they are inseparable. The form is what gives it, what gives life, what gives this specific human life to this specific matter. Without form, without the soul, there's no life. This is how we're distinguished from inanimate things. Does this mean for Aristotle that when the body dies, the soul dies? Apparently it means so, which was very disturbing to so many people. So if the form has no existence except as in matter, or the matter has no existence except as informed, then they dissolve together. But the form and the soul in this case plays more than one role. It doesn't just simply produce life. This is what, its production of life is what Aristotle calls a first perfection, entelechy. And when I say a first perfection, it means that there is a second perfection, which is intellection. And one of its functions is to intellect. It's clumsy, to reason, to know intellectually as opposed to knowing sensorily. Sensory knowledge is that which derives from the senses. But intellectual knowledge is that abstraction that I've mentioned earlier on. You have this natural capacity to abstract whiteness from a white cup, right? And this is what Aristotle would call the potential intellect. Potential in the sense that the whiteness in the cup was already laying there waiting to be intellected. It was potentially intelligible. And if it is potential, like the acorn, it needs something to bring it to actuality, to make it a tree. Otherwise, if it rots, then that potential is not fulfilled. This is why Aristotle would have to evoke an active intellect. And this allows for some keyhole for medieval thinkers to suggest that the active intellect is immortal. So even if the body dies, some part of the soul survives. Nevertheless, this remains the main attraction, or one of the main attractions of Plato. And you find a strain of Plato even in St. Paul. In the Christian tradition early on, you have, for example, one of the very influential philosophers called Pseudo-Dionysius, who was a 6th century, 6 centuries later, or 5th century Syrian, was translated and was thought to be a disciple of St. Paul, someone who has met St. Paul. But this was a full Neoplatonist. I'll tell you what's Neoplatonism in a minute. And as such, his ideas became very legitimate in medieval Christianity. Of course, the main influence in medieval Christianity, the main Neoplatonic influence is St. Augustine. And when I say that St. Augustine produced or reproduced Neoplatonism in a Christian context, I don't say that this is the only source of intellectual activity in Christianity. Definitely he had his own combination, which builds on the Christian tradition itself, on Scripture. But what I'm trying to say is that early on there is a Platonic strain, and there is something which is very appealing for religious constructs in Platonism. In the 2nd century BC, before Christ, you had, this is still Hellenistic, this is still in Egypt, this is still much the product of Alexander's conquest. You had a major Jewish population, but very few of them knew how to read Hebrew. So a translation was attempted, was fulfilled in 132 BC, of the Bible from Hebrew to Greek. So you had a Jewish population and a Greek population at the same time, and the Egyptians, the native Egyptians in Alexandria, all of them speaking Greek, and all of them falling under the influence of Neoplatonism to an extent. A central figure here is Philo the Jew. And Philo made so many things which would allow later on Neoplatonism to be assumed into Christianity. For example, he called reason, logos, the only begotten Son. And as such, later philosophers, when they wanted to talk about God, they could identify Jesus, the second person in the Trinity, with reason. Now, I kept mentioning Neoplatonism. The central figure is Plotinus, who was an Egyptian but spent much of his life at Rome, 3rd century, 204 to 270. Very extremely influential figure. I couldn't find a better picture. Nevertheless, the slides aren't helping me in any case. Plotinus and his school are nowadays called Neoplatonism. But he would be outraged to think that he's a Neoplatonist. He's a Platonist, he would think of himself. And he thinks that Plato's approach to things is very suitable, but it creates some problems. Of course, when you suggest that there are 2 degrees of reality, or 2 worlds in a sense, the question is, how do they relate? And Plotinus would have to populate the middle ground with certain entities to tell us how do they relate. Plotinus issues from 2 ideas in Plato. One of them is that the only proper explanation is through resort to the forms. Another is that what gives being to things, what creates things, to use a problematic term, is what gives things unity. So he had to posit something which he calls the one, which is beyond being. The world of forms would be, in a sense, what Plotinus calls the intellect. There were many steps as we go which would tend to merge Aristotle and Plotinus and bring the forms into some sort of mind. And this would become in Plotinus the intellect. And this is equal to Plato's God, the demiurge, the artisan God or the craftsman God, who shapes the world, fashions the world, and creates the world according to these forms. So he plays an active role. Now, the one being perfect, Aristotle would call it something like فوق التمام. So it gives rise to things. Its perfection overflows. People call this scheme emanation. And the intellect overflows as a batkun and gives us the world soul, and the world soul emanates and produces the material world that we live in. I have to rush. Another very important figure is Porphyry. He was a student of Plotinus, and he played a very important role in harmonizing Aristotle and Plato. The categories that I've said were found very difficult by Platonists to swallow were made a major part of the curriculum of the Neoplatonists. And Porphyry could do this by saying that it's a different subject matter. It has to do with the way we think, the way we use language. It doesn't have to do with the way reality is constructed. Porphyry is very important also in delineating Aristotle's approach to definition, but I don't have time to discuss this now. I'm sure you'll get back to it when you start reading Maimonides. Two last comments. Much of the work of Aristotle was received in the Arab world, in Arabic philosophy, whatever you want to call it, the philosophy of the Islamic world, maybe Islamicate is the proper term. But some of the works of the Neoplatonists were translated and thought to be works of Aristotle. So despite the fact that very few philosophers would mention Plato, the Aristotle that they deal with and assume they are commenting upon is a Platonized Aristotle, is a product of several centuries of work by Neoplatonism. And the Arabs as well, or the Muslim philosophers, were very enthusiastic about the harmonizing project, but not all of them. Ibn Rushd, as you will see, wanted to purify Aristotle from the effect of Neoplatonism, to separate Aristotle from Plato. Ibn Sina realized that some of the works that were thought to be written by Aristotle were written by Neoplatonists, but he didn't mind. He was part of this harmonizing project. So the Arabs had access to many of the books of Aristotle and Plato and the Neoplatonists, whereas in Europe they didn't have much of it. Part of it was translated early on, but the rest of it was translated in the 13th century. And most of these translations came by way of the Arabic one. I'll stop it here, and I wish you an interesting semester.